Most people believe strength is easy to recognize. The biggest muscles, the loudest confidence, the heaviest lift. But on that afternoon inside a crowded gym, the strongest person in the room was the one nobody even noticed. He was the old janitor. The quiet man mopping the floor while everyone else chased attention. When a group of young athletes finished lifting 300 kilos, they decided to challenge him. Just for fun. They thought it would be a joke. And seconds later, the entire gym went silent. Most people walk into a gym to prove something, to prove they are stronger than yesterday, to prove they are disciplined, to prove they belong among the people who lift heavier, run faster, and look more confident in the mirror. Gyms are strange places that way. They are filled with effort, sweat, and ambition, but they are also filled with silent competition. Every mirror reflects more than muscle. It reflects pride, insecurity, and the quiet desire to be noticed. On most afternoons, the gym on Jefferson Street was exactly like that. Rows of machines stretched across the floor, bright lights hung overhead, reflecting off polished metal bars and thick black rubber mats. Music pulsed through hidden speakers, a steady rhythm that blended with the clanging of iron plates and the dull thud of barbells hitting the ground. People moved with purpose. Some jogged on treadmills, their headphones sealing them inside their own worlds. Others rotated between benches and squat racks, wiping sweat from their foreheads and checking their reflections in the mirrors that covered almost every wall. Strength lived everywhere in that room. It showed itself in broad shoulders and tight grips around steel bars, in chalk dust rising like smoke from powerful hands, in quiet nods between lifters who recognized each other's effort. But strength in that place was also visible. Loud, sometimes. Confident, almost always. And because it was so visible, people believed they could easily recognize who the strongest person in the room was. They believed strength looked a certain way: young, athletic, confident. What they didn't realize was that the strongest person in the building that day did not look like any of those things. In fact, most people barely noticed him at all. Near the far wall of the gym, moving slowly between the weight benches, now was an older man wearing a faded gray cleaning uniform. In one hand, he carried a mop. In the other, a small bucket of cleaning solution that sloshed quietly as he walked. His movements were calm and deliberate. He wiped sweat from benches that others had just abandoned. He gathered loose weight plates from the floor and placed them neatly back onto their racks. He cleaned chalk dust that had settled like pale footprints across the rubber mats. He did all of this quietly, without drawing attention. Not that anyone was really looking. People stepped around him without thinking. Some didn't even notice him until the last second, quickly shifting their feet so they wouldn't walk through the wet floor he had just cleaned. A few gave polite nods, the kind people offer automatically when passing a stranger. But most people simply looked past him. To them, he was just part of the background. Another invisible worker keeping the place running. Another janitor. And the man didn't seem bothered by that. He had the relaxed patience of someone who had spent many years watching people move through their daily routines. His face carried soft lines that suggested age, but also a quiet steadiness. Occasionally, he would pause near a rack of weights and straighten the bars that had been left crooked. Then he would move on. No hurry, no complaint, just quiet work. Across the room, the atmosphere was very different. Near the center of the gym, and a group of younger lifters had gathered around one of the squat racks. They were loud. Their laughter bounced off the mirrors and echoed through the open space. They spoke with the confidence that often comes from youth, strength, and the belief that the world is still waiting to be conquered. One of them, a tall man with thick arms and a sleeveless black shirt, stood beside a loaded barbell resting on the floor. Moments earlier, he had completed a heavy lift. Now he paced in small circles, shaking his arms and breathing hard, while his friends clapped him on the back. 300 kilos, one of them said with admiration. Another whistled. Man, that was clean. The tall lifter grinned, clearly pleased. The barbell lay on the ground beside him, stacked with thick plates on each side, the metal collars still vibrating slightly from the impact of the drop. Around them, several other gym members had paused to watch. In a place like that, strength always attracted attention, and the tall lifter looked down at the barbell with pride. "Strongest lift today," he said. One of his friends laughed. "Strongest lift in the whole gym." The others seemed to like that idea. They nodded and chuckled, enjoying the moment. And not far away, still moving quietly along the edge of the room, the old janitor continued mopping the floor. He didn't look at the group. He didn't react to the noise. He simply worked, guiding the mop slowly across the rubber surface in smooth, careful strokes. And to everyone else in that gym, the story of the afternoon seemed simple. Young athletes celebrating their strength. Another normal day in a place built around competition and effort. But what none of them realized, what none of them even suspected, was that the quiet man cleaning their floor had once lifted more weight than anyone in that room ever would. And before the day was over, every single person in that gym would learn just how dangerous it can be to underestimate someone they barely see. In a place built around strength, confidence spreads quickly. The gym on Jefferson Street had its own rhythm, a pattern that repeated itself every day. People arrived, warmed up, pushed themselves harder than they had the day before, and left believing they had earned their progress. And in the center of that rhythm were always the people who lifted the most weight. They drew attention naturally, not because they asked for it, but because strength, when displayed openly, has a way of pulling every eye in the room toward it. That afternoon was no different. The tall lifter who had just completed the heavy deadlift stood near the bar, still catching his breath. His arms were thick, his shoulders wide, and the veins along his forearms were still raised from the effort. He shook out his hands and flexed his fingers. The barbell lay on the floor beside him, loaded with heavy plates that gleamed under the bright overhead lights. 300 kilos. Even experienced lifters knew that was not an easy weight. One of his friends crouched beside the bar and nudged one of the plates with his shoe. "Man, that was clean," he said again. Another leaned against the squat rack and laughed. "I'm telling you, nobody else in here is touching that today." The group seemed to enjoy that idea. It wasn't just about the lift. It was about what the lift represented. Dominance, proof. In gyms like this one, lifting the most weight meant more than just strength. It meant respect. The tall lifter glanced around the room. A few people nearby were still watching. Others had returned to their workouts, but even they seemed aware that something impressive had just happened. He smiled. 300 kilos, he repeated, almost to himself. One of his friends clapped him on the shoulder. "Strongest lift in the building." Another voice chimed in from behind them. "For sure." Laughter spread through the group again. A few feet away, leaning casually against one of the mirrored columns, stood a young woman in a short red dress. She didn't look like someone who had come to lift weights. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup carefully done, and her phone was held up in front of her face. The camera lens pointed toward the group of lifters. She'd been recording the moment. People loved watching strength online. Heavy lifts, dramatic reactions, big personalities. Social media turned moments like this into quick bursts of attention. She tapped the screen of her phone, replaying the lift she had just captured. "Okay, that was actually impressive," she said. The tall lifter turned toward her with a grin. "You got it on video?" "Of course," she replied. She tilted the phone slightly so he could see. The screen showed him gripping the bar, pulling the weight off the ground and locking his hips at the top of the lift. From the angle of the camera, the moment looked even more dramatic. The tall lifter laughed. "Post that." "Oh, I will," she said. Another lifter leaned closer to look at the phone. "Caption it, 'Strongest guy in the gym.'" That suggestion earned more laughter. Drifted closer. A few strangers drifted closer. A few strangers nodded respectfully at the lifter. In places like this, strength often acted like a quiet currency. A heavy lift could earn admiration from people who had never spoken to you before. Meanwhile, the rest of the gym continued its routine. Treadmills hummed, weights clanked, music pulsed softly in the background, and along the far edge of the room, the older janitor continued his slow, careful work. He moved past a bench where someone had left a damp towel. He wiped down a machine that still carried the warmth of its last user. Then he walked toward the center aisle, guiding the mop across the floor in long, smooth strokes. His presence barely registered with anyone. The group of lifters remained focused on their own moment. One of them bent down and examined the barbell again. "You think anyone else in here could lift that?" he asked. The tall lifter shrugged. "Maybe." But his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. Another man in the group laughed. "Not today." The woman in the red dress shifted slightly, scanning the room through her phone as if searching for another moment worth recording. Her camera drifted past the mirrors, past the squat racks, past the rows of benches. Then it paused. Her eyes followed the lens toward the far side of the gym, toward the older man with the mop. For a second, she simply watched him. The contrast between the two scenes was almost strange. On one side of the room, loud celebration. On the other, quiet routine. A man lifting enormous weight, and another man quietly cleaning the floor beneath everyone's feet. The woman tilted her head slightly. Then she let out a small laugh. It wasn't cruel exactly, but it carried the kind of amused disbelief that people sometimes feel when they notice something that seems completely out of place. She lowered her phone just a little. "Hey," she said to the group, "look at this guy." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Several of the lifters turned their heads in the direction she was pointing, and for the first time that afternoon, the group's attention shifted away from the barbell and toward the quiet old janitor slowly mopping the floor. The moment began so casually that no one in the gym realized how important it would become. At first, it was just a glance. The young woman in the red dress tilted her head slightly, still holding her phone in one hand, and watched the older man moving slowly across the floor with his mop. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He simply pushed the mop forward, paused, then pulled it back again in smooth, careful strokes. The small bucket beside him rolled softly across the rubber mat as he moved. But something about the contrast caught her attention. On one side of the room stood a group of young athletes celebrating a heavy lift. Loud voices, confident laughter, energy filling the air. On the other side stood a quiet old janitor in a faded gray uniform, cleaning up after everyone else. She let out a small laugh. "Look at this guy," she said. The words weren't shouted. They were spoken with the casual tone people often use when pointing out something amusing. But the nearby lifters heard it. The tall man who had just completed the 300-kilo deadlift turned his head first. "What?" he asked. The woman nodded toward the older man. "That guy." Several of the others followed her gaze. For a second, they simply watched. The janitor moved slowly, almost methodically, guiding the mop across the floor near the racks. He seemed completely focused on his work. One of the lifters chuckled. "I didn't even notice him before." Another laughed quietly. "Yeah, he's been here the whole time." The tall lifter crossed his arms and studied the man for a moment. Then a faint smirk appeared on his face. He stepped slightly forward and raised his voice just enough for the janitor to hear. "Hey." The older man stopped. He lifted the mop slightly and turned his head. "Yes?" he said politely. His voice was calm, respectful. He didn't sound annoyed or surprised, just attentive. The tall lifter nodded toward the barbell still lying on the floor beside the squat rack. "You ever lifted before?" For a moment, the gym seemed to hold its breath. Then someone in the group laughed. The question was clearly meant as a joke. The woman in the red dress raised her phone again. Moments like this were exactly the kind of content people liked online. The janitor glanced at the barbell. Then he looked back at the young man. His expression didn't change. "A long time ago," he said. The answer hung in the air for a second. Then the laughter started. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the easy kind that spreads quickly through a group when someone says something unexpected. "A long time ago," one of the lifters repeated. "Yeah," another added with a grin. "Probably when dinosaurs were still around." More laughter. Someone clapped their hands once, amused by the comment. The woman filming covered her mouth briefly as she tried not to laugh too loudly into the camera. The janitor didn't react. He simply held the mop upright beside him. His posture remained relaxed. There was no anger in his face, no embarrassment either, just quiet patience. The tall lifter stepped closer to the barbell. With the toe of his shoe, he nudged one of the large plates, making the metal ring softly against the floor. "You think you could lift that?" he asked. The tone of his voice made it clear he wasn't expecting a serious answer. Another man in the group shook his head dramatically. "Careful," he said. "He might break a hip." That earned another round of laughter. Even a few people working out nearby had begun to notice what was happening. Some paused between sets, curious. Others glanced over their shoulders while adjusting weights. The woman in the red dress moved slightly closer, adjusting the angle of her phone so both the barbell and the janitor were in frame. If the old man tried to lift it and failed, the clip would be perfect, short, funny, shareable. The janitor looked down at the barbell again. It was heavily loaded. Thick iron plates stacked on both sides of the bar, secured tightly by metal collars. 300 kilos, a weight that demanded real strength. For a moment, the older man said nothing. The room waited. Behind the group, someone whispered to a friend, "Is he actually thinking about trying?" The janitor slowly leaned the mop against the nearby wall. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded cloth. He wiped his hands carefully, still calm, still quiet. The group's laughter faded slightly. Something about the way he moved had changed the atmosphere in the room. The tall lifter tilted his head. "You don't have to do this," he said with a half smile, "but go ahead if you want." The woman filming held her phone steady. Every eye in the area was now fixed on the older man. The janitor stepped closer to the barbell. His shoes stopped just inches from the steel bar. For the first time, the noise of the gym seemed to soften. Music continued to play. Weights still clanged in the distance. But near the squat rack, the air felt strangely quiet. The old man looked down at the bar. Then he bent slightly at the waist and placed both hands on the knurled steel. And suddenly, without anyone quite understanding why, the laughter stopped. Something in the air had changed. Only seconds earlier, the moment had felt like a joke, a quick distraction between sets, a small piece of entertainment before everyone returned to their workouts. But now, as the older man stood over the barbell with both hands resting on the steel, the room felt different, quieter, more attentive. The tall lifter who had started the challenge folded his arms across his chest. His expression still carried a hint of amusement, but the laughter had faded from his eyes. The janitor didn't seem to notice the attention. He simply studied the bar in front of him, 300 kilos. For most people, that number meant almost nothing. It was just a number on plates. But for anyone who understood lifting, it represented something serious, the kind of weight that separated casual lifters from professionals. Behind him, someone whispered, "Is he actually going to try?" Another voice answered softly, "There's no way." The woman in the red dress steadied her phone, zooming in slightly. This was turning into something far more interesting than she had expected. The old man shifted his feet, just a small adjustment, but to the few experienced lifters in the room, it was noticeable. He positioned them directly beneath the bar, about shoulder width apart, balanced, intentional. Then he bent down slightly and wrapped his fingers fully around the steel. His grip was firm, comfortable, not hesitant. The tall lifter raised an eyebrow. Most beginners grab a barbell awkwardly. They shift their hands, adjust their stance repeatedly, unsure of where to place themselves. But the janitor's hands settled immediately, like someone who had done it many times before. One of the men in the group leaned toward his friend. "Look at his back," he whispered. The janitor's posture had changed. His shoulders rolled slightly forward, his spine straightened, his hips lowered just enough to bring tension into his legs. It wasn't dramatic, but it was precise. The tall lifter tilted his head. For the first time since the moment began, a small thread of curiosity appeared in his expression. Still, he shrugged it off. "You don't have to do this," he said casually. His tone wasn't hostile. If anything, it sounded almost generous, as if he were offering the older man an easy way to step away from the challenge. "You might hurt yourself." The janitor didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow breath through his nose, then another. The movement was subtle, but the experienced lifters watching recognized it instantly. Preparation. The moment before a heavy lift. Across the room, several people had stopped their workouts entirely. A man near the dumbbell rack lowered the weights in his hands and stared. Two runners on the treadmills slowed their pace, glancing sideways. Even the music playing through the speakers seemed less noticeable now. All attention had shifted toward the barbell. The janitor tightened his grip. His fingers curled deeper into the rough knurling of the bar. The steel didn't move yet, but tension began to travel through his arms. His back flattened, his shoulders set. The tall lifter's smile faded slightly. Something about the older man's posture felt familiar. Too familiar. Still, no one spoke. The woman in the red dress leaned closer, adjusting the angle of her phone. Her screen now showed the full scene. The barbell, the plates, the quiet old janitor preparing to attempt a weight that had taken a trained athlete to lift only minutes earlier. Someone in the crowd muttered under their breath, "This is going to be bad." Another replied softly, "Yeah." But no one told him to stop. Curiosity had taken over. People wanted to see what would happen next. The janitor took one final breath. Then he looked down at the floor just ahead of the bar. Not at the people watching, not at the lifters who had challenged him, just the floor. His focus seemed to narrow into something small and controlled. For a moment, he remained completely still. Then his legs tightened. His arms pulled gently upward against the steel. The plates rattled slightly as the tension in the bar increased. A soft metallic sound echoed across the floor. Everyone leaned forward, waiting. The tall lifter watched closely now, his earlier amusement completely gone, because in that brief instant, he realized something that none of them had expected. The old man standing over the bar did not look like someone who was about to fail. He looked like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And then, without warning, the barbell moved. At first, the movement was so subtle that some people in the room thought they had imagined it. The barbell trembled, not the violent shaking that comes when someone struggles with too much weight. Just a slight shift, a small, controlled rise as the steel bar bent under tension. The plates rattled softly against the collars. Then, slowly, the bar left the floor. A few people gasped. The sound escaped before they even realized it. 300 kilos was not supposed to move like that. Not in the hands of an old janitor wearing a faded gray cleaning uniform, but the bar was rising, smoothly. The older man's arms stayed straight as his legs drove into the ground. His back remained firm, his shoulders locked into position. There was no panic in his face, no sudden strain, only quiet concentration. The tall lifter who had issued the challenge stared in disbelief. Seconds earlier, he had expected the attempt to end almost immediately. Maybe the bar would twitch. Maybe the old man would pull once, realize the weight was impossible, and step back with an embarrassed laugh. That was the moment everyone had expected, but it didn't happen. Instead, the bar continued to rise. The heavy plates cleared the floor by several inches, then a foot. The janitor's body moved upward with controlled precision, as if the motion had been practiced thousands of times. Someone whispered behind the crowd, "No way!" The woman in the red dress lowered her jaw slightly, staring at the screen of her phone. the video shaking slightly in her hands as she tried to keep the frame steady. Her camera had been ready to capture a failure. Instead, it was recording something else entirely. The old man kept pulling. The bar traveled past his knees, his hips drove forward, and then he stood upright, fully locked out. 300 kilos held firmly in his hands. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze inside the gym. The bar hung motionless in the air. The thick iron plates gleamed under the overhead lights. And the quiet old janitor stood tall, holding a weight that had impressed everyone in the room only minutes earlier. No one spoke. The silence spread across the gym like a wave. The tall lifter's arms slowly dropped from where they had been folded across his chest. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The janitor held the bar for just a second longer, not showing off, not shaking, just steady. Then he lowered it, carefully. The plates touched the floor with a heavy metallic thud that echoed through the room. The sound snapped everyone back to reality. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone whispered, "That was 300 kilos. Another voice answered quietly, "He just lifted it." The woman in the red dress stared at her phone screen again, replaying the moment she had just recorded. The bar rising, the impossible lift, the silence of the room. She looked back at the janitor, confusion written across her face. The tall lifter took a step forward. He looked down at the barbell, then back at the older man. "How did you—" he began. But he stopped before finishing the sentence, because suddenly the question sounded ridiculous. The janitor didn't celebrate. He didn't smile proudly. He didn't even look around to see the stunned faces surrounding him. Instead, he simply rubbed his hands together once, brushing away the faint chalk dust that had settled onto his palms. Then he reached for the small towel he had left on the nearby bench. He wiped his hands calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. Around him, people were beginning to gather. More gym members had noticed the commotion. A few walked closer, whispering to each other. "Did you see that?" That was the janitor. "No way." The tall lifter still hadn't moved. He stared at the older man, his earlier confidence completely gone. Moments ago, he had been the strongest person in the room. Now he wasn't so sure. Finally, he spoke again. But this time, his voice was quieter. "How did you do that?" The janitor looked at him for the first time since finishing the lift. His expression remained calm, almost gentle. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could say anything, another voice spoke from behind the crowd, and the words that followed would change the entire meaning of what had just happened. The voice came from the entrance of the gym, calm, familiar, slightly amused, because he used to do that for a living. The words were not loud, but they carried across the quiet room with surprising clarity. Everyone turned. Standing near the front desk was the gym manager, a man in his late 40s who had been watching the scene unfold from the doorway. He stepped forward slowly, weaving through the small crowd that had formed around the squat rack. Several people moved aside to let him pass. The tall lifter looked at him, still stunned. "What do you mean?" he asked. The manager glanced briefly at the barbell on the floor. Then he looked at the older man holding the small cleaning towel. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Well," the manager said calmly, 20 years ago. Lifting 300 kilos was just another training day for him." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. The woman in the red dress lowered her phone slightly. "What?" she said softly. The manager stopped beside the barbell and nudged one of the plates with his shoe. "You all recognize this weight," he continued, "but most of you are too young to recognize the man who just lifted it." The tall lifter stared at the janitor again. Now he wasn't looking at him the same way. Before, he had seen an old cleaner. Now he saw something else. Experience, control, quiet confidence. The manager folded his arms. "Back in the early 2000s, he said, he was one of the best powerlifters in the country." Several people exchanged glances. One of the younger gym members shook his head. "You're serious?" The manager nodded. "Very serious." He gestured casually toward the janitor. He held the national deadlift record in his weight class for years. The words settled over the room like a sudden weight of their own. A few people looked back down at the barbell. 300 kilos. Just minutes ago, that number had seemed like the ultimate display of strength. Now it felt different. The tall lifter swallowed. "You're telling me," he began slowly, "he used to compete professionally." The manager nodded again. "For almost 15 years. The room was completely silent now. The woman in the red dress slowly lowered her phone to her side. Her video was still recording, but she no longer seemed interested in capturing the moment. She was too busy staring at the man she had laughed at only minutes earlier. The tall lifter stepped closer. For the first time that afternoon, he looked uncomfortable. Why are you working here?" he asked. It wasn't meant as an insult. If anything, it sounded more like genuine curiosity. The janitor shrugged gently. His expression remained relaxed. "I like gyms," he said simply. His voice carried the same calm tone it had held since the beginning. "And I like quiet places." He glanced down at the floor where a small patch of water from the mop still reflected the bright overhead lights. "Cleaning here gives me both." No one laughed this time. The tall lifter shifted his weight awkwardly. The confidence he had displayed earlier had disappeared completely. "I'm sorry," he said. The words sounded sincere. "I didn't know." The janitor looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled. Not a proud smile, not a mocking one, just a small, patient smile. "There's nothing to apologize for," he said. He picked up the towel again and folded it carefully. Then he walked over to the wall where his mop was leaning. He lifted it and dipped it gently into the bucket. For a moment, the entire gym simply watched him. No one spoke. No one laughed. The man who had just lifted 300 kilos, the same weight that had impressed everyone earlier, was now calmly returning to his job of cleaning the floor, as if nothing unusual had happened. Around him, something subtle began to change. People who had ignored him earlier now stepped aside when he passed. A few nodded respectfully. One man quietly re-racked the plates he had left scattered across the floor. Another wiped down his bench without being asked. The tall lifter remained standing near the barbell for several seconds. Then he looked around the room. The gym felt different now, quieter, more thoughtful. He turned back toward the older man, but the janitor had already moved on to the next section of the floor, guiding the mop slowly across the rubber mats. Just another quiet worker doing his job. Only now, everyone in the room understood something they had missed before. Strength doesn't always announce itself. It isn't always young. It isn't always loud. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one no one thinks to notice. For a long moment after the truth was revealed, no one in the gym returned to their workout. The room, which had once been filled with noise and movement, now carried a different kind of energy. Quieter, heavier, more thoughtful. The barbell still rested on the floor near the squat rack, its thick plates stacked tightly against the collars. Just minutes earlier, it had been the center of attention, proof of strength, confidence, and accomplishment. Now it felt almost symbolic, a reminder of how quickly people judge what they think they understand. The tall lifter stood beside it, staring down at the steel bar. He replayed the moment in his mind, the old man stepping forward, the calm way he placed his hands on the bar, the smooth lift, no hesitation, no struggle, just quiet control. He shook his head slightly. Moments earlier, he had believed he was the strongest person in the building. Now he realized something else entirely. Strength, it turned out, wasn't always visible. Across the room, the janitor continued mopping the floor. His movements were exactly the same as before, slow, careful, methodical. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. He didn't acknowledge the whispers that had started to spread among the gym members. He simply worked. The woman in the red dress stood where she was, holding her phone loosely in one hand. The video she had recorded was still open on the screen. She tapped the replay button. The moment played again. The barbell rising, the shocked silence, the impossible lift. But now the video felt different. Before, she had been hoping to capture something funny, something embarrassing. Now the clip carried a completely different meaning. She lowered the phone slowly. "Wow," she whispered under her breath. Not far away, two younger lifters were quietly re-racking the plates they had left scattered near a bench. One of them glanced toward the janitor. "Did you know about him?" he asked his friend. The other shook his head. "No." They watched the old man for a moment. Then the first lifter spoke again. "It's weird." "What?" "I've been coming here for 6 months. I've seen him every day." He paused. "But I never really saw him." His friend nodded. That feeling seemed to spread through the room. People were beginning to realize the same thing. They had walked past the janitor dozens of times, maybe hundreds. They had seen the gray uniform, the mop, the quiet routine, but they had never looked any closer. Never wondered who he was, never imagined that the quiet man cleaning their gym had once been one of the strongest athletes in the country. Near the squat rack, the tall lifter finally bent down and lifted the barbell slightly, rolling it back into position. He carefully removed one of the plates and set it onto the rack, then another, and another. He worked slowly, almost thoughtfully. For the first time that afternoon, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply cleaning up after himself. Across the room, the janitor finished mopping the section of floor near the benches. He rinsed the mop in the bucket, wrung it out carefully, and leaned it against the wall. For a brief moment, he paused. His eyes moved quietly across the gym. People were still lifting, still training, still pushing themselves. But something had shifted. There was less shouting, less arrogance, more quiet focus. The janitor nodded to himself slightly. Then he picked up the bucket and began walking toward the next row of machines. Behind him, the tall lifter watched for a moment. Then he called out gently, "Sir." The older man stopped and turned. "Yes?" The lifter hesitated for a second. Then he said something simple. "Thanks." The janitor tilted his head slightly. "For what?" The tall lifter smiled faintly. "For the lesson." The old man studied him for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. "You're welcome." And with that, he turned and continued walking. The bucket rolled softly beside him. The mop handle tapped lightly against the floor. Within minutes, the gym returned to its normal rhythm. Weights lifted, machines hummed, music filled the air again. But for the people who had witnessed the moment, the memory stayed with them, because that afternoon had revealed something important, something easy to forget. Strength doesn't always look the way people expect. It isn't always young, it isn't always loud, and it isn't always standing in the center of the room where everyone can see it. Sometimes, the strongest person in the building is the one quietly cleaning the floor, the one no one notices, until the moment they do. Have you ever underestimated someone, only to discover they were far more capable than you imagined? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like if this story made you think. Subscribe for more powerful life stories about respect, humility, and the quiet strength people often overlook.